It is the spring of 1943, and a man is sitting in a café in Lyon, France. He is unremarkable in every way that matters. His coat is worn at the elbows. His coffee is ersatz, bitter, thin. He reads a newspaper, or appears to. Across the street, through glass fogged with the breath of occupied city life, a German officer emerges from a requisitioned building, pauses to light a cigarette, and walks north along the pavement. The man in the café does not look up. He finishes his coffee. He folds his newspaper. He leaves a few francs on the table, buttons his coat against the April chill, and walks out into the street. He turns south. He does not hurry. He does not look back. Somewhere inside the breast pocket of his coat, pressed against his ribs, is something that might, to a passing eye or a lazy Gestapo hand, appear to be nothing more than an ordinary box of matches, the kind sold at every tabac in France for a few centimes. It is not a box of matches. What the man carries is one of the most ingenious, terrifying, and quietly lethal instruments ever produced by a British government department. A device so small it could be palmed in a handshake, so simple in concept it could be assembled by a watchmaker in an afternoon, and so deadly in application that the men and women who used it were trained never to touch the activating mechanism without first considering, very carefully, whether they were prepared for what would follow. This is the story of how Britain turned the humble matchbox into a weapon of war, how a small team of scientists and engineers working in the greatest secrecy solved a problem that had stumped military planners for 2 decades, and how their solution, silent, deniable, practically invisible, changed the nature of covert warfare forever. To understand why such a device was necessary, you must first understand the peculiar and desperate circumstances of Britain in the early years of the Second World War. By the summer of 1940, the situation was, to put the matter plainly, catastrophic. France had fallen. The Low Countries had been overrun. The Dunkirk evacuation had salvaged men, but not equipment. Germany controlled a vast swathe of Western Europe, and within that controlled territory there existed a network of railways, fuel depots, communications infrastructure, and military installations that sustained the entire Nazi war machine. Every train that ran on time from Paris to Berlin carried supplies. Every telephone exchange that hummed carried orders. Every officer who walked unmolested from his billet to his headquarters was another cog turning smoothly in a mechanism designed to maintain occupation and expand conquest. Conventional military solutions were either unavailable or insufficient. Bombing raids could destroy a railway bridge, but they required aircraft, fuel, crew, planning, and they announced themselves with the roar of engines and left craters that screamed of British involvement. Sabotage by organized resistance cells was valuable, but it required coordination, communication, timing, all points of vulnerability that could be exploited by German counterintelligence, which was, by any measure, extremely good at its job. What was needed was something different, something that required no aircraft, something that left no signature, something that could be placed by a single individual and then withdrawn entirely from the scene before the device did anything at all. Because the greatest problem with existing sabotage methods was the requirement for the saboteur to be present at the moment of action, or at least close enough to observe it. That proximity was the thing that got people killed. The problem, stated simply, was this: how do you destroy a target or eliminate a person at a time of your choosing, when you are nowhere near the scene? The answer, Britain's Special Operations Executive would eventually determine, lay not in bigger explosives or faster aircraft, but in the most unlikely of places: the chemistry of corrosion, the physics of compressed springs, and the manufacturing tolerances of the British watch industry. The Special Operations Executive, the SOE, was established by Churchill in July 1940 with the famous instruction to set Europe ablaze. It was not, at its founding, entirely clear what this meant in practical terms. Churchill was a man of dramatic language. The organization that grew from his directive was something altogether more methodical, a bureaucratic industrial complex of spies, trainers, forgers, wireless operators, couriers, saboteurs, and, crucially, inventors. The invention department of the SOE operated out of a cluster of establishments that were, on paper, entirely innocent. Station 9 occupied the Fryth, a large Victorian country house near Welwyn in Hertfordshire, surrounded by gardens and, rather more usefully, woodland that provided cover for outdoor testing. It was staffed by a remarkable collection of individuals, chemists, physicists, engineers, gunsmiths, and at least one former stage magician, who were tasked with a brief that had never existed before in British military history: design weapons and tools for people who cannot be seen to be carrying weapons or tools. The Matchbox device, known within the SOE by various designations and referred to in declassified documents under several different code names, emerged from this environment as a response to a specific operational requirement. Agents in the field had reported that getting a conventional explosive device close enough to a high-value target was often straightforward. The problem was the timing mechanism. Existing fuses required the saboteur to light them, which meant the saboteur had to be at the target at the moment of activation, and departing from a target that is about to explode is, as it turns out, rather conspicuous. The solution devised at Station 9 was elegant in the extreme. It drew on a principle that had been understood by chemists since the 19th century, that certain acids, when allowed to act upon certain metals, will eat through them at a predictable and controllable rate. By varying the concentration of the acid and the thickness of the metal, you could, in theory, create a delay of anything from a few minutes to several days between activation and detonation. The device itself was simplicity made lethal. A small glass ampule, barely larger than a vitamin capsule, contained a corrosive acid, typically cupric chloride, though the formulation varied depending on the intended delay period. This ampule sat within a brass tube no wider than a man's little finger. At one end of the tube, held under compression by a strong spring, was a striker, a firing pin, precisely machined, tensioned against the spring, and held in place by a thin wire retaining pin of soft metal. The acid ampule and the metal retaining wire were separated by a thin membrane. When the device was activated, by pressing or crushing the outer body of the tube, which broke the glass ampule, the acid began to work on the retaining wire. The rate at which it worked depended on the concentration of the acid and, critically, on temperature. A device set for a 12-hour delay at room temperature might fire in 6 hours in a warm engine compartment or take 24 hours in a cold cellar. This temperature sensitivity was a known and accepted variable, managed through training rather than engineering. As the acid ate through the wire, the spring's tension increased against the weakening metal, until at last the wire parted, the spring released, the striker flew forward, and whatever the device was coupled to, a detonator, a firing cap, a chemical igniter, was initiated. The whole mechanism, from the glass ampule to the striker, was housed in a tube approximately 9 centimeters long and 1 centimeter in diameter, exactly the interior dimensions of a standard British matchbox of the period. The outer casing could be, and routinely was, made to resemble everyday objects. Matchboxes were common. So were pencils, which gave rise to the related and more widely produced time pencil device. So were lumps of coal, a variant designed to be dropped into coal bunkers where it would eventually find its way into a locomotive firebox and detonate at the worst possible moment for the driver. Manufacturing took place at several locations across Britain, including facilities in Birmingham and in the Midlands more broadly, where the precision engineering required for the brass tubes could be accommodated within existing industrial capacity without attracting notice. Precise production figures remain, even now, a matter of some uncertainty. Records were kept imperfectly. Some were destroyed at the end of the war, and the classification attached to certain elements of SOE production has not been fully lifted. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of the devices were produced over the course of the war in various configurations, though the exact figure is likely never to be known. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. In operational terms, the Matchbox device and its variants were deployed across the length and breadth of occupied Europe, and their use was as varied as the imaginations of the agents who carried them. The most common application was railway sabotage. A device placed on an axle box, the bearing housing at the end of a locomotive's axle S, would, when the bearing heated during normal operation, accelerate the acid's action and bring forward the detonation, causing what appeared initially to be a mechanical failure. The locomotive would need to stop, engineers would be called, delays would cascade. In some cases, the detonation caused derailments. German railway engineers, encountering what appeared to be an unusual mechanical fault, could spend considerable time investigating the wrong cause before identifying what had actually happened. And by the time they understood, the saboteur was 200 kilometers away, sitting in another café, reading another newspaper. There are documented accounts from resistance networks in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands of the devices being used against German staff cars, against fuel storage facilities, and against communications infrastructure. The Norwegian resistance, operating under conditions of particular difficulty given the density of German occupation and the sparseness of the civilian population that might provide cover, found the time delay mechanisms especially valuable precisely because they removed the need for anyone to be present at the moment of action. Psychologically, the effect on German forces was considerable, and this effect was, in some respects, as important as the material damage caused. An enemy that can see the bomber coming can, at least in theory, respond to it. An enemy that finds, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that something has inexplicably caught fire or exploded in a location that was quiet and undisturbed the previous evening, that enemy faces a different and more corrosive problem. They cannot patrol against it. They cannot arrest their way out of it. The threat is diffuse, anonymous, and could, for all they knew, be inside any package, any item, any seemingly innocent object that passed through their hands. Records from German security services suggest a genuine unease about this, an awareness that occupied territory was not as controlled as it appeared, and that the British had found a way to reach inside it without being seen. The Germans, it should be noted, were not without their own capacity for ingenuity in this area, and a fair comparison demands acknowledgement of what the Third Reich's own technical establishments produced. Germany did develop time-delay fusing systems, and certain elements of German sabotage equipment were technically sophisticated. The Brand bomb, HE, incendiary devices used by German agents, were, in some formulations, delayed action. But German covert operations in Britain and elsewhere were, on balance, considerably less successful than British and Allied operations in occupied Europe, and part of the reason for this lay in the support infrastructure. An SOE agent in France could draw on a network of safe houses, forgers, wireless operators, local resistance contacts, supply drops, and logistical support that German agents in Britain largely lacked. The devices themselves were only part of the equation. The Americans, through the Office of Strategic Services, eventually developed their own versions of similar mechanisms. The OSS Limpet mine and various time-delay devices drew on British designs and, in some cases, on British manufacturing, with the exchange of technical knowledge between Station 9 and OSS research establishments being a largely one-way transfer, at least in the early years. American industrial capacity eventually produced equivalent equipment in quantities that dwarfed British production, but the original engineering concepts were, in the main, British. What the British Matchbox device represented that its contemporaries did not was a fundamental insight about the nature of covert warfare, that the most effective weapon is not necessarily the most powerful one, but the one that is most deniable, most portable, and most difficult to defend against. A Lancaster bomber carrying 10 tons of explosives is a formidable instrument. But it requires a crew of 7, an airfield, a maintenance establishment, and it announces its arrival with the sound of 4 Merlin engines. A device the size of a matchbox requires 1 person, a pocket, and a working knowledge of railway axle boxes. The legacy of the SOE's work in this area extends well beyond the specific devices produced between 1940 and 1945. The conceptual framework that sabotage can be industrialized, that delay mechanisms make saboteurs survivable, that everyday objects are the best concealment for operational equipment, became foundational to post-war thinking about covert operations in every major intelligence service in the world. The British government's own special forces and intelligence services drew heavily on Station 9's wartime work in developing post-war capability. The Americans took the lessons of the OSS experience, much of which was built on British foundations, into the Central Intelligence Agency and later into the Special Activities Division. Soviet sabotage doctrine, as it was understood by Western analysts in the Cold War period, incorporated similar principles of delay mechanism use, though whether this represented independent development or intelligence-assisted acquisition of Allied techniques is a question that records from that era may never fully answer. More concretely, surviving examples of the SOE's time pencils and related devices can be seen at a number of museums in Britain. The Imperial War Museum in London holds a collection of SOE equipment that includes examples of the delay mechanisms in various configurations. The Special Forces Club in London, an institution so discreet that many Londoners are unaware of its existence, maintains its own archive of material from the wartime period. The Welwyn Garden City area, where the Frith still stands as a private facility, retains a connection to this history that is, by the nature of the place, not particularly well advertised. What cannot be seen in any museum, and what no archive fully captures, is the experience of the men and women who carried these devices across blacked-out airfields, parachuted with them into hostile territory, and then placed them, carefully, correctly, with the measured calm that training imposed over fear, in the right location at the right moment, before walking away, unhurried, into the dark. Return, then, to the café in Lyon. Return to the man with the worn coat and the bitter coffee and the newspaper he was not reading. He is a composite. He did not exist in this precise form, but he existed in hundreds of forms across the occupied world, men and women carrying devices that the designers at Welwyn had built and the trainers at Ersatz had taught them to use. What he carried was not merely a weapon. It was the distilled answer to a problem that conventional military thinking had declared insoluble. How do you strike at an enemy that controls the territory, the population, the railways, and the roads? You do it by exploiting the one thing they cannot control: time. You activate a mechanism that does not care about curfews, does not respond to identity checks, cannot be stopped at a roadblock. You set it going, and you walk away. And somewhere between 3 hours and 3 days later, in a place you are no longer in, something happens. The genius of the Matchbox device was not its power, which was limited. It was not its range, which was 0. It was not its complexity, which was almost laughably simple once you understood it. The genius was the gap it opened between the act of sabotage and the saboteur, a gap measured in hours and kilometers, a gap just large enough for a man in a worn coat to finish his coffee, fold his newspaper, button against the cold, and disappear into the gray streets of an occupied city, alive. The Germans controlled France for 4 years. They built walls and checkpoints and informer networks and counterintelligence operations of formidable sophistication. They could not build a wall against a device the size of a box of matches and the ingenuity of a team of British scientists in a country house in Hertfordshire who understood, better than anyone, that the most dangerous weapon in the world is the one your enemy cannot see coming. That was what Britain hid inside a matchbox. Not fire, not matches. The future of warfare itself, small, patient, silent, and absolutely lethal.